Okay, well, welcome everyone to the first session of today's Triple M. This is one of the sessions I've been looking forward to hearing about. We have two wonderful professionals here joining us outside of New York, but have great information to share with us. And I'm happy to introduce Christina Llewellyn, who is the Executive Director of ATLAS, the Association for Technology Leaders in Independent Schools. When the pandemic struck, she and her team had less than 30 days to transition to a virtual conference. And once they did, she was vocal about sharing her experiences and helping other associations executives navigate the process. She grew in Western New York, but it's cold there, so she now calls Virginia home. She has 4 teenage daughters, which is why she has an office outside of her home, just so she doesn't have to share her Wi-Fi. I know many of us can relate to that. Our next professional is Jeff Tenenbaum, one of the nation's leading nonprofit attorneys and an accomplished author, lecturer, and commentator on nonprofit legal matters. As managing partner of the nationally recognized Washington, D.C.-based Tenenbaum Law Group, Jeff counsels his clients on the broad array of legal issues affect trade and professional associations, charities, and other nonprofits. Among numerous other honors and awards, Jeff was the 2006 recipient of the American Bar Association's Outstanding Nonprofit Lawyer of the Year Award and is one of only 5 lawyers in the prestigious U.S. 500's Not-for-Profit Hall of Fame. Christina, Jeff, welcome.
Hey, hi, thank you guys. Thanks so much for having us. Really appreciate it.
Yes, very welcome.
So, Jeff, do you want to frame this up at all, or should I just kick it off? Go for it.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for our session today. This is the second time that Christina and I have presented together on this topic. It went really well last time, and hoping that it will go equally well this time. But to help ensure that it goes well, we need your participation. We need your questions. We need your input, your feedback, your experiences. This is designed to be a very interactive session. So please pose questions to us throughout, and we'll be happy to take them. So the way this is going to work is that, as you all know, as every association executive and frankly executives on the other side, on the hotel and venue side, know all too well, it's been an extremely challenging last 12 months. And the pandemic has struck both associations and the hotel and convention center a convention community equally hard. Some harder than others, but it's been hard on everyone. We've struggled throughout the last year with the challenges dealing with event and meeting cancellations of in-person conferences and gatherings. Struggles back and forth on both sides, trying to figure out how to get through those difficult times in a way that mitigates the downside risk to both the associations and the event sponsors, as well as those that host the events. We have gotten through, I think, a lot of it. But as we continue now into 2021, as we hopefully are turning the corner toward the end of the pandemic, as more and more economies across the country, states and cities and counties are kind of reopening and starting to lift restrictions, while it may be a bit longer in some places, we fully expect that will happen as the course of the year goes on. What we're still finding is that many associations and many association members remain reluctant to travel to in-person gatherings. And from surveys and other things we've seen, we expect that to continue for most, if not all, of this year. So that poses some real challenges, both for associations and hotels. We're here speaking from the association perspective, of course, but it poses some real challenges because the types of tools that association, their legal counsel, like my colleague and I, were able to utilize last year, things like force majeure, terminations without penalty because states and cities and counties were not allowing gatherings of certain sizes to happen. As those things go away, as force majeure becomes effectively non-existent in so many places. It's still very much relevant in certain cities and states right now, but it will become increasingly irrelevant. Then the challenge is, what do we do about how to balance wanting to hold an in-person event, but recognizing we have far fewer people than attended in the past, perhaps not dealing with the potential cancellation penalties that associations were looking at last year with an all-out cancellation of the in-person event, but looking at potentially significant attrition penalties, which are those penalties that are levied on a meeting sponsor for failure to meet the guaranteed minimums both for food and beverage revenue and for sleeping room revenue if there's sleeping rooms involved. And that's a very significant risk. So as a result of all this, not surprisingly, a lot of folks have been talking about hybrid meetings. A lot of associations have already planned hybrid meetings. Some have actually already had them on the smaller side, but many more are planning them as we go into 2021 as a way to balance that. But it doesn't completely deal with all of your issues related to attrition and whatnot. So what I found fascinating when I read about Christina's example, and she had actually made a video about this and posted it on some ASCE kind of Collaborate forums. I watched and I thought, wow, this is an interesting approach to how to deal with these challenges and how to deal with it successfully in a way that mitigated the downside risk for her association, but also provided as much of a win-win, for the hotel as possible. And so I thought it would be a great opportunity for us to pair up and speak together about that. That's kind of the evolution of this. She and I did speak about this. It was a really engaging presentation, I thought. So I'm going to turn it over to Christina, who's going to be the more engaging part of the two of us, is going to walk you through her story and how it came about and how she did it. And the reason I'm interested in it, obviously I'm interested in her particular situation, but even more so because I think it has lessons for all associations on kind of creative, then that's the whole topic title here, creative solutions for associations 21 meeting and conference legal challenges. This provides, and variations on this, I think, provide a tool and a way of thinking about these challenges that might be very effective. Not the only tool, not the only solution, not right for everyone, but something that I think has some broad potential applicability. So with that, I'll talking and turn it over to Christina.
Well, thank you so much. I think this is probably one of the few audiences where I probably don't need to be too self-conscious about how quickly I speak, given my New York roots. So let's go ahead and peek at this. So again, I'm Christina. I'm the executive director of Atlas. We're technology leaders in independent schools. So basically what that means is our members are CIOs and technology directors at private schools. And so this is the theme of our content, of our conference. This is the theme of our year, Undaunted. And certainly if you take a moment and think about what it must have been like to transition an educational setting, especially for K through 12, in just a matter of days. We've definitely seen some shell-shocked members in the last year. So we thought that this year's conference being themed Undaunted would probably be pretty fitting. And so far it has been. As Vanessa mentioned as she was introducing me, I was one of the early sufferers of the force majeure situation. We were supposed to have our conference in Chicago in the first few days of April. And so literally, 30 days before that, we were panicking and figuring out how to move to virtual. We off a really successful conference, but then we had to turn our attention to what 2021 would look like. And so I think anybody who was in that early phase, the early wave of force majeure, it was like you dodged a bullet, but then what you didn't really realize is that more bullets were coming at you. And that's exactly the situation I found myself in. So I did not face big penalties. I didn't face big fees from the Chicago venue, but right on its heels, I had this contract in Seattle. And as it turns out, I am literally a year and a half away from the virtual component of this event. But if we kind of rewind to where my head was in the fall of 2020, and part of why I decided to share this idea that I came up with and had the support of my board, thankfully, I wanted to share because it was a different way to approach it. And again, it may not fit for you. My scenario might be a different size or a different situation, but for what it's worth, there's some nuggets in here of kind of how to kind of pick this apart in a way that doesn't just had to be a better solution than just cancel, right? And
Christina, before you move on, can I just interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
Can you explain to everyone, you said for your 2020 conference, which you canceled the in-person and did solely virtually.
Yep.
Is that correct? You were able to get out of all cancellation penalties. How were you able to do that?
Force majeure. Chicago shut down. So in April of 2020, we were right in the midst of it, and the hotel was like, yeah, we can't have you. And so there was a governor's mandate, and so there was no argument about it.
How far out were you at the time that you reached out to the hotel to say you needed to cancel? How far away from the start date of the meeting were you?
For 2020, Literally, I was at Great Ideas in Salt Lake City in the first couple days of March, and rather than go to any of those sessions, I was in the hallway on the phone with our lawyer, with my hotel, and we were trying to figure out, because the world was blowing up. No one knew anything. And what was so awkward about it is that in those first few days, I apparently was the first association executive to be concerned about canceling, because I was on the phone with the hotel and they were like, oh, it's going to be fine. Oh, it's going to be all right. And I was like, I think you're right, because I'm surrounded by people who do my job and they don't think it's going to be fine. So we were early, so it wasn't as if anyone was giving anyone a heads up within that 30 days. So again, by April 4th, when many of us were still trying to figure out how to even get the mail from the office or pay a bill online, I was running a virtual conference. So I was very early to that game.
Okay, so your in-person conference was scheduled for like 30 days out from when this all
when the world shut down. Yes,
hit the fan. Yep. So the reason I say that is that, just as an aside, and many of you know this from personal experiences with your own associations, with force majeure termination, the most important factor, there's a lot of factors, how the clause is written, what state you're in, what city you're in, all of that, but the most important factor is how far out you are from the time you want to cancel to the start date of the meeting. Because if you're too far out, generally more than 60 to 90 days out, most hotels will reject a force majeure termination, and certainly did reject or pushed back or threatened to reject a lot last year. Where you can get closer, especially like you were 30 days out, then it becomes pretty much a no-brainer if you're in a state or city that doesn't allow a meeting like that to happen. Now, fast forward, I'll let you continue your story. Sorry for interrupting, but I wanted people to be able to compare and contrast that scenario, what we're looking at now, which is a very different scenario. But with timing, still a factor, because there are a lot of places like where I'm at in DC where gatherings even of your size would not be allowed right now, right? And if you're meeting, we are in the end of March right now. If there was a meeting scheduled 30 days out in DC and someone wanted to do a force majeure termination, even for a small meeting of 100 people, there would be no trouble getting the hotels to agree to that. But a meeting scheduled for this coming July, August, September, it becomes a lot more difficult, because no one knows, with the vaccine distribution and everything else, are restrictions like that going to be lifted here in DC and elsewhere? And therefore, if you try to attempt a force majeure termination right now for, say, an August meeting in DC, I think a lot of hotels are going to push back, which means you need to consider some other alternatives like you are now going to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. And that's very much, I appreciate that, Jeff, because that's where my headspace was. This slide, I want us to kind of go back to last fall, which is, I am surrounded by a lot of associations that are trying to figure out how early can we cancel. And what the energy I was feeling from my colleagues were, well, we can't wait till 30 days out. We have to let our members know. And yet, exactly what Jeff is just saying, force majeure doesn't kick in until it depends on this window. So I was hearing all of these conflicting, it depends on the hotel, it depends on the state, and I am just not the kind of sit around and wait and see what happens kind of a person. So I started lining up some facts and also sharing these facts with our board. So normally when we're an in-person event, we're about a 500-person event. I've changed, later on I'm going to show you some financials that I've changed the numbers rather than sharing my actual numbers with you, but to give you a sense of how I thought through this. But traditionally, we're a 500-person event, and we were growing before the pandemic. So it could have been 5, it could have been 600 people. I knew that to have anything over 50 people, I was watching what's going on in King County in Washington, which is where Seattle is. We had to get to phase 4, which, was tracking numbers of new cases per 100,000 of the population. So to get to a big event, I knew we had a long way to go back when I was trying to consider how to handle this in the fall. I knew that there was another group on our dates at the hotel, but there was a possibility that they were going to be canceling because they were in the medical profession. So I was working with my hotel. I was talking to them early. I did not go in there with my hair on fire screaming that they had to let me out of my contract, because frankly, I saw other colleagues doing that and it was not getting them anywhere. So being mad at your hotel for a pandemic that they did not start was not necessarily a strategy that I wanted to use. So I was communicating with my hotel directly. I was not pulling my lawyer in. I mean, I was keeping him posted, but I was not pulling him in every 5 minutes. I was just talking to the hotel. So who's in my hotel? Who am I sharing with? Well, it looks like that other group, which was a medical group, was prepared to cancel and pay the fees and not be in our space. Okay, well, that gives me some wiggle room. So my next question for them was, all right, well, given the current situation, how many people can you accommodate? If you were to follow COVID appropriate spacing and safety measures that the hotel chain was promulgating, what would it look like? Yeah, because you're clearly not going to fit 1,500 people in this ballroom with 6 feet of distance. So what does the diagram look like? Started with that. And the final little bit in terms of my getting a feel for my strategy and how I personally wanted to handle this is that I did attend an in-person conference. And some of you may have seen that because I blogged about it on LinkedIn. I know Vanessa dropped my LinkedIn. So if you want to go see that, I basically said, I attended a conference during COVID. Here's what I liked. Here's what I hated. But going to that event, and I had to take the sacrifice of staying away from my family when I came home. There were no vaccines. It was a risk, but I decided to go because if I myself was going to try to hold an event in a COVID environment, I wanted to know what made me feel uncomfortable. So it was a really critical learning experience for me. So then I started watching the numbers, and I will not belabor this, but I wanted to bring you into my headspace, which September 8th, like, things were going okay in the fall, if you remember, okay? 77 per 100,000. By September 23rd, that number had actually gone down. Okay, maybe this is okay. But then we got into the fall, and some students were going back and colleges were going back, and that number started going back up. And by the time we hit the end of November, it was even higher. So this is where I was like, look, we are either going to do this standoff, even more than a game of cat and mouse. It was like a game of chicken with the hotel. Who's going to be the first one to pull? And I just don't really care for that. So I'm the type of person, I want to make a plan and then I just want to do the plan. So I started like leaning back on there's got to be a creative way to do this. I do have an MBA. So I started thinking about basically the nature of a hedge strategy. How can we come up with a way to compromise or come up with this win-win? Again, this is not my actual contract, but just for the sake of walking you through this example. Let's say the orange text or the light orange text at the top was my original contract. So my room blocks was valued at approximately $500,000. My F&B requirement was around $200K. And if I had canceled in the fall, I had until January 3rd. Where I had canceled, I would have faced the fees, approximately $410,000. If I canceled after January 4th, that number would have jumped. So naturally, my board was asking questions like, do we cancel? Do we, when we cancel? My first step was I went back to that space diagram that I had requested from the hotel. And as it turns out, they looked at their big ballroom. They put individual tables 6 feet apart. What could they safely accommodate? Approximately 200 people. And if my event, which was a 600-person event or 500-person event, now they can only accommodate 200, I didn't even need a lawyer to have a conversation about reducing my obligations because they can't accommodate 500 people. Then how can they expect me to spend that much? How can they expect me to meet my attrition minimums, etc.? So what we did is we went back to the drawing board and said, okay, Seattle Hotel, if you can only accommodate 200 and some people, what does that look like in terms of dollars? So without getting lawyers involved and without having, any kind of conflict or confrontation, we struck out that orange colored, the original numbers, and we negotiated down into the teal blue color. And it was about a 40% reduction across the board. Now, at this point, they did offer me that if I wanted to move to a future date, I was still going to be obligated to pay them that $246,000 cancellation fee, but that they would apply 50% of it to a future date. So that also put in my head, okay, these guys need cash. I mean, that's just the bottom line. These hotels are suffering. They're our partners. And, until this all happened, we were walking in lockstep. Everybody wins. So I knew that they needed some cash, right? So again, I said, here's what we need to do. We need to come up with a strategy that will offset my risk and protect Atlas, but also I was not going to go in screaming and demanding to be let out of my contract. So the first thing I did was I looked around at other virtual events, because you remember we talked about how I went virtual very early. My first virtual event was basically at the very, very front end of the pandemic. But I knew my second virtual event, which would be, if we were going to do a virtual thing, would be in April. In fact, it's a couple weeks from now. So meanwhile, a whole year has gone by, and the other associations who are in my space have also hosted virtual events with varying degrees of success. So I looked around at what they charged, what their headcounts looked like, whether they invested in platforms. I want to make sure that we weren't pricing ourselves out of the market. Some of those other associations, 2, 3, and 4, those are more regional associations where I'm a national association. So I also knew I could be at the top tier or the upper end in terms of pricing. So what I did was, we came up with our hedge strategy is basically, in a nutshell, here it is. We're going to host a virtual event in the beginning of April. And that virtual event would deliver the core content that we would normally deliver at an Atlas event. So, 2 full days of content, deep dives, keynote speakers. So we would deliver the entire event virtually in the beginning of April. But then the hedge, so that we're not canceling on our hotel, is that we would also host an in-person retreat a few weeks later. And that would be a deeper dive. So the idea would be, please attend the virtual component. You'll get all the content that you would normally get from an Atlas event. But then if you can travel, if you're comfortable traveling, if vaccine distribution is widespread enough, you make your personal choice. If you'd like to do the deep dive retreat, you may come. And the brilliance of this, or the unique energy around this, is that the retreat is a lot cheaper. So I will show you how this lines up from a math perspective in a couple of slides. But as you can tell, that we're still making the core of our money on the virtual event. And then the retreat is like this very nominal add-on. So pay for those breakfasts and lunches and coffee breaks, that's going to come out of the virtual earnings, the virtual revenue. One little piece of this before I line this up side by side for you is that, as it turns out, we later went to our hotel. So originally the plan was that the virtual event, and the virtual event is going to be April 12th and 13th. And then the retreat, the in-person retreat for a much smaller group of people is going to be in late April. When the Biden administration started making commitments about how quickly the vaccine would be rolling out, I then called the hotel and I said, look, they were following the strategy. They knew what I was doing. They knew I was not canceling, but that I was just planning a much smaller workshopping program with the retreat. And as it turns out, the head count was a little low. We weren't sure what to expect. I think a lot of people were kind of waiting to see. And so I happened to make an offhand comment, with this announcement about vaccines, man, if I could just have 60 more days. To which the hotel responded, well, everyone in the summer has already canceled, so I could look at dates for you. So as it turns out, original hedge strategy has been expanded because we have now pushed the deep dive, the retreat, into late July. The reason we were able to do that, again, no lawyers, just another quick addendum, is that as long as they're getting their revenue in the same fiscal year, they didn't care whether we had it in April or whether we had it in July. And they've also had all of their events canceled from really skittish people who are like, we got to cancel. So I pretty much had my pick of the litter. So I picked a weekend in late July that works for industry. So we're actually going to have the retreat in late July. People are thrilled about this. So we had a fair number of people taking us up on the offer of the in-person thing in late April, but now that we're having it in late July, we're seeing those numbers climb. We even have to cap it. We'll see how it goes. But what ended up happening is that we had to add a la carte pricing, because in the beginning, what we talked about was that in order to go to the retreat, you couldn't just pay $99 and go to the retreat. You had to do the sessions at virtual in order to qualify for that $99 rate. Well, now that there's such a break between the virtual and the retreat, we had to offer a la carte pricing. So that's a little bit of a separate thing that came later, but I'll show you how this lines up from a math perspective, and I'm just about done with my case study. Again, these are not real numbers, but it gives you what I was thinking about. If you look over in the first column, if we had, for example, if we had gone down the path of having planning the retreat and getting closer and closer to the event, if Seattle could not legally host us, if we had gotten to, April 1st and we're looking at an April 28th retreat, if they weren't able to host a 200 person or a 100 person event because of government regulations, then of course, as Jeff is going to talk about, we would have had to have a conversation about force majeure, right? But what this strategy did was it put the ball in their court. I wasn't going to cancel on them. I was basically waiting to see whether they could accommodate me. So if they had ended up canceling, if the retreat had been in late April and they had to cancel on me for the inability to host an event 100 people, then the first column is where my budget would have ended up. So I would have made this money on the virtual, right? Made a lot of the revenue in the virtual piece because that was the more expensive piece. And so and then I wouldn't have had any in-person expenses. I wouldn't have had to pay for F&B. I wouldn't have had a master room tab for my board members, right? There were certain costs that crossed both events, like a keynote and and software that we needed. But there were certain expenses that would just go away if Seattle was able to host us, right? Now, if we were obligated to have the retreat, you see that in the second column, where we would have made a little bit more money. Naturally, if the retreat component had gotten canceled, I would have given back all that $99 or $199 registration fee that had been fully refunded. But I still would have had all the revenue from the virtual component. If with the retreat, we would have made a little bit more revenue, but we've made the bulk of our revenue in the virtual component, and then I have expenses. So then I just plugged in some placeholder numbers. Say, my AV is 45, my F&B is 150. Either way, I still make money. And if you remember in the beginning of the session when we were talking about what my fee would have been for canceling, rather than paying the hotel $250,000 in fees that may or may not apply to a future date. Instead, I'm at least making $250,000, even if I have to host the in-person component of it. So the reason that this is a hedge strategy is that I was going to make money either way. So I presented this to the board, and they understood that if we had to have the retreat, then naturally we were going to have some costs, and we would be meeting our contractual obligation. We would not be hit with any big fees. We would not have legal issues. Hooray. If for some reason Seattle was able to host us, then it's almost like a windfall because we still made the money on the virtual component, but we didn't have all those expenses. Couple of quick things before I turn it back over to Jeff. Naturally, attendee safety is first and foremost. I had the hedge strategy is a business approach, but there's a very human approach to this pandemic, and part of it was keeping our attendees safe. So trust me that when I talk about going to that Connect event, an in-person event during COVID, I learned a lot. I've done a lot of research, and I was working very, very closely with the hotel, which is my final bullet, which is who's in charge of what? Are you paying for hand sanitizer? Am I? Who's putting the signs on the floors? Who's making sure that people are staying spaced out at the buffet line, or however we handle that, right? So attendee safety was something that I had to dive into personally and make sure that we could assure our members that we were going to take good care of them. Naturally, communication, this is a very weird strategy. So we also needed a clear amount of communication. So that undaunted logo that we came up with, that theme for the conference, we started calling it the virtual conference and the in-person retreat. So we were very clear that they were two separate things that could be added together for one full conference experience, depending on what the attendee chose to do. We also had to set some very clear and firm expectations regarding staying in the hotel. Even local people will be required to stay in the Seattle hotel to minimize the transient nature of going home or staying in another hotel. We're trying to create as much of a bubble, a pod as we can. Mask mandatory, health screenings. But let me tell you this, I will say that I have the benefit of my members are at independent schools. They have many of which have been back in person for some time. So I am not going to have people making anything political out of wearing a mask, because these are folks that work with students K through 12. They understand that to be on campus, you have to go through a health screening, you have to wear a mask. So I'm fortunate in that vein that I see no issues with having an in-person event, because I know that there will be good behavior on that front. The other thing we came up with as just a side note, because a lot of people are interested in this, I found, as you'll see if you read my blog on LinkedIn about going to an event, the most uncomfortable aspect was eating and drinking. And eating and drinking is something we do as social people. How am I going to feed my people but keep us masked and safe? So we came up with the idea that the main ballroom is where a lot of the retreat will take place. It's a very plenary kind of in-depth workshopping kind of thing. So I had all this space in the hotel, and you remember I showed you that the other event that was on our dates canceled. So I was like, good, I'm going to stretch out then. The hotel was very accommodating because they had no other events going on, and they were just glad to make some money rather than none. So we're going to spread out into all my traditional breakout space that's in my contract. And I created the idea of like meal pods. So Jeff and Christina, you're in a meal pod. You will always go to room A with these other two people. You will spread out. You will remove your mask. You will eat in your meal pod. So that's something that came from my independent school world because they had to figure out how to feed kids and keep them safe. So this is, assigned seating at the event, meal pods, to minimize our maskless time. So that is how we came up with the Undaunted strategy. And again, we were fortunate. The one little piece from the last time that I presented with Jeff is that our hotel, I said, hey, how about 60 days later? We picked a summer date. They're thrilled because in all likelihood, they're going to make more money. And I'm thrilled because in all likelihood, more of my audience will feel comfortable attending. So we're going to do Seattle in late July, which is just really not anything to complain about. So that is our strategy.
Thank you, Christina. That was terrific and incredibly helpful. I did have one follow-up question, and if you said this, I might have missed it. But earlier on in your presentation, you said that the hotel said that if you agreed to hold that in-person retreat, that they would take half of the cancellation penalties that you would have otherwise owed and applied it basically as a deposit toward the in-person retreat, and the other half you would have to pay in cancellation penalties. How did that other half part end up working out? I mean, did you have to pay the other part? Is it going to be contingent on how many people register?
No, actually, I just knew. I never had that conversation with them. It was just as part of the conversation of like, what are your other clients doing? So I wasn't threatening to cancel. I wasn't planning to cancel. I never indicated I would cancel. But I did say, what's been going on when people cancel? And she says, we're trying our best with people. And in some cases, I've been able to get approval to take half of the cancellation fee and apply it. So I never had to have that conversation, nor do I owe that because I wasn't going to cancel. That number was important, Jeff, when I went and had conversations with my executive committee and with my board, because they needed to understand that even if we just outright canceled, we had to write a really big check and then they would sit on it for years. If we rescheduled, our next available date is in 2026. So are we going to send them $250,000, of which $125,000 is applied to an event in 5 years? So we never did that. There is no fee. So at this point, what my contractual obligation with the hotel is simply that that we reduced down how much I'm obligated. They also reduced the threshold for attrition. So instead of meeting 80%, they also reduced it down to 60. So not only did I reduce the numbers by 40%, but then the attrition number is lowered. So I'm not facing any penalty because my full intention is that we're having this event in July and we're going to meet those numbers.
Yeah, that would be the only way you could get hit with attrition penalties is if you had lower expected attendance. And say there's a virus surge in July in Washington and people stay away and whatnot. Okay.
Yeah, so the risk is not zero. Like we have not yet had the event. The membership seems very positive about it. People were registering when we thought we were having it in April, and all those people have been contacted. They know we're having it in July. They're very excited about that. The only other thing that I forgot to mention, and this is an aside, but I know that people who do my job are kind of interested in this, and that is, what about tabletops? What about exhibits? I will say that is another piece of the conversation that I didn't want to have because everybody around me in our space was telling me how awful it is. So the whole virtual booth thing, I had zero interest in it. My vendors had zero interest in it. I wasn't going to do it, right? I'm a small staff. I don't have time for it, and it's not useful. Nobody likes them. The attendees don't like them, and the the booth people don't like them, the sponsors. So I also came up with a whole separate strategy regarding sponsorship. We're not talking about that here, but just know that I know that'll be a question. And so we are going to have a few tabletops in Seattle with a limited number of our vendor partners. But what we did was, if we're used to making $100,000 or $150,000 in tabletops, I changed the conversation. I changed the strategy. We launched a new magazine. We offered new things we've never offered before. We have a new buying guide that we've never done before. So that also took a lot of work. So if you're going to lose the revenue from tabletops, you got to figure out how you're going to make that up. So I just wanted to address that was something very separate that I also had to deal with in terms of a virtual event.
Yeah, that is a topic of interest. I deal with it through the contracts, but I also deal with it through the tax analysis, specifically unrelated business income tax. I wrote an article recently that ASAE published about kind of virtual trade show income, and is it subject to UBIT or not? And the one thing I've seen from some of my clients and others, even feedback from the article, is that so many people just aren't doing virtual trade shows because they're not very popular, and they're difficult to pull off, and they don't seem to engage a lot of interest. Even in my article, I suggested that associations look at trying to convert some of those corporate partnerships to other types of relationships like sponsorships. And it sounds like that's exactly what you've done. The one thing to keep in mind, just from a tax planning perspective, is that a true qualified sponsorship payment, as defined in the federal tax code, does not apply in the context of periodicals, like newsletters, publications, even generally a buying guide is a slightly different animal, like a conference. But regardless, the buying guide may or may not be subject to a separate exception for convention and trade show income. Just keep in mind that whether it's classified and can be classified as a sponsorship payment or advertising for tax purposes, the difference, because you're going to pay corporate income tax if it's deemed to be advertising. And sometimes you don't have a choice. If it's going to be in a periodical, even if it's going to be in a buying guide and it looks and smells like an ad, it's probably going to have to be treated as taxable income. And that's not the end of the world. The corporate income tax rate, at least for now, is a flat 21%, lower than it used to be. That may or may not go up, but still just keep that in mind. Back to the cancellation penalties. It sounds like the hotel in the beginning was saying you would potentially owe these, and for other clients, able to maybe get half applied to a future meeting and half you pay in cancellation. In the end, you negotiated a solution that did not require you to pay any cancellation penalties. Just keep in mind that other associations who maybe didn't have the ability to pull off any type of in-person gathering and are just looking at a rebook to a future year, maybe even like you, 5 years out. Some have had to, especially the later on we've gotten in the pandemic when these negotiations are getting harder and harder. Some have had to negotiate some split between, taking some of the cancellation penalties that would otherwise be owed, applying it to a future conference, paying it as like an advance deposit sometimes, and then sometimes paying some cancellation penalties now. We've probably worked on 600 or 700 conferences over the last year. We've been able to get the vast majority of our clients out of paying any cancellation penalties. But sometimes it's all about what kind of leverage you have in these negotiations, right? Your ability to offer up another similar large meeting, the sooner the better. If it's a year or two or even 3 from now, it's a lot better than 5, 6, or 7 years. But sometimes associations don't have a choice. Other tools we've been able to do to try to give the association more leverage, pay larger advance deposits. If you're going to pay it anyway, the thinking is it's not, and if you have money, maybe it's not a big deal to pay a larger advance deposit, and the hotels and convention centers certainly need the cash flow. Sometimes some associations have decided they're okay paying some cancellation penalties. In those situations, we've been able to negotiate those down pretty low. Increasing your food average minimums for your future events is something that's been a tool to help kind of grease the wheels, give you a little more leverage. And sometimes offering up some smaller meetings, one or more smaller meetings, like a board meeting, smaller conference, even if it's 3 years from now, throwing that in with a rig of your large meeting can help. We've had some that have actually booked 2 future large meetings. We had one last week that finally inked the deal on that as a way to get out of their cancellation penalties. And they were okay with that because they liked the venue, they liked the city, and they did one for, I think, 2 years from now and one for 5 years from now. I think that. So those are all kind of negotiation tactics when maybe you're not able to come up with a Christina type solution for this hybrid solution, hedge solution, as she calls it. And you just have to do a straight rebook, but keep those kind of things in mind. And Christina, correctly zeroed in on the attrition penalties and was successful in negotiating down both. And when she says the minimums as well as the attrition penalties, so the minimums these are your guaranteed minimums for sleeping room revenue and food and beverage revenue. The attrition penalties are generally, if you don't hit 70% of your sleeping room revenue, then you're going to get, a penalty of X amount on top of that. But she was able to reduce that 70% down to 60%, whatever the case may be. And all of that is really, really important. Like she said, it doesn't guarantee there won't be any attrition penalties, but if all goes well, knock on wood, and things continue to get better with respect to the pandemic, it sounds like there's a great she won't be stuck with any attrition penalties come late July. Another shifting gears now to all of that was kind of about the cancellation negotiation strategies. And of course, I talked at the top of the webinar about the use of majeure as a tactic, which is still, a very valid and viable tactic for associations to contemplate in those states and cities where the large meetings are not allowed. But like I said earlier, timing is key. And if the closer you can wait to the start date of your meeting to pull the trigger on a force majeure termination, the greater the chance that it will be accepted if you're in a state or city that currently bans that sort of size of meeting. But the longer out it is, especially once you get over 90 days, we are seeing incredible pushback from the hotel community, and not surprisingly. So just keep that in mind. And then it's counterbalanced by the fact that, there are very few associations that can wait till 60 days out to pull the trigger on cancellation. There's too much pressure from their members and others to make a decision. So that's a challenge heard hundreds and hundreds of times over the last year from my clients. And Christina referred earlier to a game of chicken, which is kind of the term that I've used many times on calls with clients over the last year. And, Christina's strategy enabled her to avoid doing that. And we've had a number of clients that said to me, Jeff, we want a strategy that doesn't involve that sort of waiting and playing this game and the leverage and saying who's going to blink first. But some are willing to do it. And for many who took my advice, were patient and didn't pull the trigger too soon, it actually paid off for them in terms of being able to successfully pull off a force majeure termination. But I think the important thing to take away from this is there is no one size fits all solution. Every association is different in terms of the size, the economic, state and city where the meeting's going to be, the dates of the meeting, the risk tolerance of your board, your members and their desire for an earlier solution. We had one, I think last year, like in the fall, that said they already wanted to cancel a fall meeting for 2021, almost a year out. And I told them, and their members are basically insisting on it, and they're a very well-off association. They have the money. And they said, we know we can't do a force majeure termination. It'll never work. So just negotiate, the best deal that you can. So, whether it's for a rebook of the meeting or just paying some cancellation penalties. So keep that in mind. Now, switching gears to holding in-person meetings, as many associations like Christina's are planning to do, contemplating to do in the coming months. From a legal perspective, not surprisingly, the question I get the most is, okay, we're planning on holding an in-person meeting this summer. What can we do to mitigate our liability risk, and specifically the liability risk to the association if someone contracts the virus at your event and tries to hold the association liable for that, saying it was the association's fault that they were negligent in their health and safety protocols or otherwise, and that kind of contributed to the attendees contracting of the virus. So a few thoughts on this. First off, I wrote an article all about this that goes into great detail about all the different things that you can and should do, and ASAE published kind of a version of it in their magazine about a month or two ago. First off, Christina is doing a lot of these things already. And I don't know if her lawyer advised her or if she just instinctively is good at this stuff. I know she's instinctively good at this stuff. But she already touched on a lot of these things. The basic legal standard is, was the association deficient, negligent in not meeting the prevailing standard of care in holding the meeting? That standard of care meaning what is kind of the minimum requirements that you need to do in order to protect the health and safety of your attendees and your staff. So where do you find that standard of care? Where do you Google it and look it up? Well, you don't in any one place. But like my article talks about, you first look to any mandatory, in this case, state and local requirements that say, what are the requirements for how you hold in-person meetings? And there are a lot already that are out there in terms of capacity restrictions on venues, in terms of social distancing requirements, in terms of mask wearing, in terms of sanitation requirements and other things like that. So whatever is legally mandatory, you obviously start there. But the second place you look is what is advisory from a governmental body, particularly from the federal government, from the CDC specifically. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has some very good detailed guidance on how to safely hold large gatherings in the era of COVID-19. And while these are advisory in nature, they're not mandatory, they definitely help to inform what the standard of care is. So you want to do as many of those things as you can do, as you can afford to do. And this is really important, like Christina said, if you read through that guidance, and there's links to it in my articles, if you read through the guidance, you'll see that more than half of the recommendations apply to the venue, not to the association. Because there are things like sanitizing of surfaces and air filters and other things like that that obviously the association can't do. But the association, what it can do is try to get the hotel to obligate itself to do these things. It doesn't need to be in your contract itself. It can be through an email exchange. It can be from a document you work up. But you want to say, you hotel, a convention center, or whatever the venue is, you agree to do the following things. And like Christina said, you want to go through very specifically, what are your protocols going to be for food service and food preparation and all this other stuff that's really important for how meetings are set up. It's really important to do that. I also attended an in-person meeting in late August in Savannah for the Georgia Society Association Executives. I was speaking at it. Also, obviously, no vaccines at that time. But I was, I did it, well, in part as a favor to the executive director, who's a friend, but also because I was curious about, how an association who was determined to pull off a safe meeting in the time of the pandemic, how they were able to do it. It was very instructive, it was great. No one contracted the virus. They had all the right protocols in place. But like Christina said, the one kind of weak link that was really difficult was food and drink. That was the most difficult way to, help ensure health and safety, and not for the sit-down meals, like the breakfast and lunches that were in the big ballroom. They had big, huge round tables, and they had maybe like 5 seats, only chairs set up at each table, very well spaced. And these are huge tables, so there was 6 feet between attendees. So if you went, sat down at your chair, ate your meal, took your mask and ate your meal, it was a fairly safe environment, right? Would be obviously even better if it was outdoors, but pretty safe environment. Where the breakdown really occurred was the stand-up, the classic association reception at a conference, where there's orders being served and people are at the bar getting drinks. And there, it's so difficult to do that in that environment. And I think while we're still living with COVID, that type of environment, whether it's the big opening reception, whether it's the reception at the end of the day, after the event, it's going to continue to be increasingly difficult. Obviously, outside safer than inside for sure, but finding ways to get people distance. And I thought Christina's idea, which was the first I heard of that, with your kind of pods of people eating essentially together in different breakout rooms, is a brilliant idea. Yeah, and you might have to consider cutting out the receptions, which are some of the best parts of all of these events, as we all know, for those of us who have attended countless association conferences and receptions over the years. But for now, it's clear that even with the vaccines, for a whole variety of reasons that and I don't need to get into, this pandemic is still going to be with us for a while, and it is still going to have an effect on how conferences are conducted. The CDC is still going to guidance about a lot of these things that they recommend you do, which means it informs the standard of care, which means legally you need to do these things if you want to protect yourself from liability. However difficult it might be for an attendee to try to successfully prove as a plaintiff that they actually in fact contracted the virus at your event. If there's an outbreak and you got a cluster of people that contracted at your event, causation is not going to be that difficult to prove. But regardless, you always want to do whatever you can to meet that standard of care. And that's going to mean you're going to have to go to these protocols at least for the rest of this year and likely, into next year as well. And so working with your hotel to try to allocate responsibilities between you guys is very important. Two other things on this that I get asked about a lot, and then we'll open it for questions. One is liability waivers. Should you have your attendee sign a liability waiver that, in my mind, has two parts to it? One is the part that says, I recognize that COVID is inherently risky, that there's no guarantee. No matter what you do, guarantee I won't contract it. I'm knowingly assuming the risk, and I agree to hold you, the association, harmless from any liability that might result if I contract the virus at your event. That's part one, and that's the liability waiver. Part two, though, that I wrote in the liability waiver I wrote for that Georgia Society conference in August, and that is part of the model liability waiver that we have on our website. Part two says, I, attendee, agree to abide by all of your conduct restrictions and prohibitions. So I agree to masks in all public areas. I agree to abide by your social distancing protocols. Like Christina said, another brilliant legal insight from a non-lawyer, which is, having people agree to stay at the conference hotel, to not stay elsewhere, to agree not to go off-site crowded bars and other things like that, which do exist in a lot of states, as I'm sure you've heard, to not engage in those riskier behaviors that could, in fact, cause risk to the rest of the attendees. Getting an affirmative obligation from the attendees to that is very helpful. It just helps to reinforce the rules. It helps you to have a little more leverage to enforce the rules if you get some non-abiders, which does happen. We've already heard at some events, and it can help you just from an overall liability perspective. And then the last question I get, and we're not quite there yet in terms of timing, but we will be there very much sooner rather than later in terms of widespread vaccine eligibility. Supposedly every adult is going to be able, who wants to get a vaccine, may well be able to within the next month. Certainly eligible to, and probably able to within a month after that, is can our association impose a mandatory vaccination requirement? Now, I'm not getting into the politics of this. I'm not suggesting that your association do it. In some industries, that would probably be heresy. Some associations don't want to touch those politics with a 10-foot pole. But in some associations, in certain sectors, in certain professions, in healthcare and other places like that, where they're used to that, it will not be surprising to me to see those associations willing to impose a mandatory vaccination requirement as a precondition of attendance at the in-person conference. And from a legal perspective, the short answer is that generally, yes, you can do that for attendees. The rules are very, very different for staff because there are a whole host of federal and state laws that protect the rights of employees that do not apply to association attendees. They do apply to employees. I had 2 calls with clients this week to talk through all of the legalities of potentially mandatory vaccination requirements for employees returning to the workforce and going out into the field, doing work travel on behalf of the association. There's some really difficult, sticky issues when it comes to staff. And that also, by the way, applies to staff attending your conferences. Now, if all of your staff are vaccinated anyway, then it might be a moot point. But staff aside, if you wanted to have a mandatory vaccination requirement, how it gets proven obviously is an issue that's very much under debate right now. But if you wanted to, with the one exception being the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act, which does require places of public accommodation, which include conferences and hotels, to make a reasonable accommodation for those with a disability, as long as it doesn't pose an undue burden on the association. As long as, for instance, you're making the educational content available to those who say cannot get a vaccine for various health-related reasons that might constitute a disability. As long as you make that available to them, you should be okay from an ADA perspective, and you could impose a mandatory vaccination requirement. So I throw that out there so you know the legal construct. I'm not advocating it one way or another. I'd be interested to see over the next 6 months or so how many associations actually do impose such requirements, but that's the lay of the land. So that's all I have for now. Why don't we, Christina, do you have any follow-up comments or thoughts? And then we can close it out with any questions from the audience.
No, I don't think any follow-up to what you said. I know that there was a question about the virtual pricing. And so a kind of related comment, this is just my opinion. In case you hadn't noticed, I have a few of those. And I did not jump on the bandwagon of drastically reducing our pricing, as you saw, for the virtual offering, because the content and the value didn't change. If anything, we increased the degree of value that we offered in our delivery. And so I know a lot of associations were very quick to run to the reducing price or free model. And I don't judge that. If that works for you and your association, I understand that everybody's a little bit different. That's a really slippery slope. It was not a hill that I wanted to climb in an uncertain future. I didn't want to offer a free conference or a very cheap virtual conference that then put my staff at risk the following year. Or any kind of strategic plan growth, So for me, we kind of stood firm. We understood that not all schools could afford the full price. And if we can, we make accommodations. But in terms of virtual pricing, I stayed high. And so far, it's been okay.
Other questions? Hold on, I'm just posting a link to everyone for the, there's this one longer article I wrote about kind of the top 10 challenges for associations in in-person meetings or something like that. It contains in there links to the CDC guidance I referred to. It also contains links to my article and model liability waiver. So that should pretty much give you all of what you need. I saw that, Vanessa, I think you had sent out a link to kind of a broader collection of our stuff, but there's a lot of stuff on there. So
there's a lot of stuff.
But it's going to be hard to find this stuff. But I'll this out right now.
There's a question in the chat to you, Jeffrey, explaining the use of force majeure within 60 days of an event.
Yeah, so this is not about the technical language of the force majeure clause, although it does. There are some newer force majeure clauses that we're seeing, particularly from Marriott properties, where they are proposing essentially a COVID-specific provision to the, this is force majeure clauses for new contracts that are being entered into. And it basically says, if there's, COVID-related, it actually, in a lot of them says, restriction, like a prohibition or a recommendation that the meeting not be held. And if that is in place 60 days out or less from the meeting, then the hotel will let you out without penalty, although they usually say there's an obligation to rebook within the next 12 months, something like that. In that situation, 60 days is actually coming from the clause itself. And in any future potential cancellation, you would have to look to that force majeure clause and look to that 60-day mark. What I am talking about is those clauses didn't exist prior to the pandemic. So every contract that was in place prior to the pandemic didn't have any language like that. It just had the basic standard provision, which says, if anything happens that's outside of the control or foreseeability of the parties, that makes it impossible or illegal to hold your event, then either party can get out without liability. That's the basic construct of a force majeure clause. Some say illegal, impossible, or commercially impractical, or illegal, impossible, or inadvisable, which is more favorable language for the association. The vast majority of the clauses, though, probably 85% that I've seen, say illegal or impossible. In those situations, the question then becomes, because the law is fairly clear that, well, sometimes we make arguments to the contrary, but the most common understanding of the law in this area is that you look to what facts exist at the moment in time that you pull the trigger on canceling the event, that you send that written notice of cancellation to the hotel. What situation existed on the ground in terms of governmental restrictions, things like that. And what is the likelihood, the reasonable likelihood that those restrictions would be in place by the time your meeting rolls around? Right. And obviously there has to be some commercial reasonableness to when you pull the trigger. You can't wait till the day before a large conference, even a small conference. It's just not practical. So the question is, how much is enough time? What we've seen over the last year and what I've advised countless clients to do is to never pull the trigger on force majeure until you're at least 90 days out from the meeting. Ideally, closer to 60, but most can't wait that long. So I've said 90. And what our experience has been, at least until now, at least for all of the conferences last year, is that if you could wait until 90 days out, most of the hotels convention centers would accept that force majeure termination, because it reasonably can be expected that those restrictions would remain in place for the next 90 days. But any more than that, we've gotten huge pushback that said, no, you don't have a crystal ball. You don't know what's going to happen, 120, 150 days from now. So we're going to reject your force majeure termination. So that's where that comes from.
And there's another question in the chat. In terms of PR, how do you promote a live event that some members may oppose and or respond to pushback related to how do you ensure photos from the event, especially on social media, showing social distancing and other safety measures?
For me, again, it just speaks to my audience because they've got the same things going on at schools. So I think that my expectation is that they will behave themselves. But I think that beyond that, there's just the disclaimers of, you can only control what you can control, and hopefully it becomes a non-issue. I don't really care if people are upset that we're having an in-person event, because we've been very clear that if you are not able, if you are not comfortable, this is not mandatory, it's a choice. So I frankly have not heard a single thing. Nobody's grumbling because, we haven't gone out there and waved the flag of we're right and you're wrong. We're just saying if you don't want to come, don't come. So it's been okay.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that approach. Making, in-person attendance at conferences voluntary, I think is going to be, it's always voluntary, obviously, but, having that virtual option makes it truly voluntary, and then messaging it that way, I think, is important. But the other part of it is with two things. One is, and you know this, Christina, you're going to have to police your rules at your event, right? And if you see a lot of crowding without masks and things like that, or even just too big crowding of people with masks, you got a cluster of 12 people all close together talking, or just like singing your favorite thing to do, doing karaoke or things like that, that can be very dangerous, and the hotel's not going to police that. It's going to be on you and your staff, your officers, things like that. So that's going to be part of it. And then the last thing is, look, the policy of all of this that we all see and read about and hear about every day, they make their way into associations as well. So a lot of this is going to depend on, is your association, you guys here, presumably most of you are from New York, has a certain kind of, political, at least most of the state, mindset to it. Whereas in a lot of other states, as you know, in the South and elsewhere, it's very different. So there's going to be a different culture, from members and staff of those associations versus those in New York. And also the industry that's represented by the members makes a big difference as well. And so all of those things really need to be factored into your calculations.
All right, well, this has been really informative. What a great session. I really appreciate Christina and Jeff joining us for this hour, a part of Triple M. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being with us. If there's any follow-up information, we'll be sure to reach out. I did share your LinkedIn contact information, so I'm sure that people will be reaching out and looking to connect. You are welcome to stay with us for a little while. We are going to transition to a little bit more lighthearted presentation and play some Jeopardy. And we have a couple winners from last time, so you're welcome to stay. But otherwise, please have a great rest of your afternoon, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Vanessa. Take care.
Thanks so much.